The war between the Human-Terran Union and the Xyloran Empire had lasted for many long years. Planets had been destroyed, families on both sides had lost loved ones, and soldiers were tired of endless battles. Space fleets patrolled burned star systems, and supply ships flew constantly just to keep the war machine alive. It was a conflict no one really wanted anymore, but neither side had trusted the other enough to stop. Every attempt at peace had failed. Every negotiation ended in suspicion, accusations, and new attacks. Finally, after too many lives lost, both governments realized they could not continue fighting forever. Something had to change. Something big enough to convince both sides to put down their weapons. Diplomats searched for a solution, and finally an idea emerged from an old tradition used by ancient rulers on distant worlds: a political marriage. If two powerful figures were joined together, the union could represent a guarantee of peace. It could make both governments responsible for the safety of the other. It was a difficult solution, and many leaders argued against it. But the exhaustion of war was stronger than pride. In the end, both sides signed the agreement. The marriage would happen. The Human-Terran Union chose Commander Alexander Hale. He was not only a decorated soldier, but a man known for calm thinking and strong intelligence. He had fought in many battles but was not a man who believed in unnecessary killing. His strategic mind had saved thousands, and his ability to stay polite and composed under pressure made him popular among the diplomatic council. They believed he would be a strong representative of humanity and a symbol of good faith. When he received the assignment, Alexander accepted without hesitation. He believed peace was worth any personal sacrifice. Even a marriage arranged not for love, but for the survival of entire star systems. The Xyloran Empire chose Princess Sarilith, eldest daughter of the Emperor. She was respected across the empire. Trained in leadership since childhood, the Xyloran were a proud warrior species, with a culture built on honor, physical strength, and ancient tradition. To them, humans were smaller, weaker, and less physically impressive. Many nobles viewed this marriage as insulting, a symbol of surrender that their empire had never made in its long history. Sarilith herself did not resist publicly, but privately, she felt the same weight as Alexander. She had trained to become ruler, not a symbol in a political game. Still, she wanted the war to end, and understood that leadership meant carrying heavy burdens. She agreed to the marriage and prepared to meet the human who would become her husband. When Alexander traveled to the Xyloran capital world, he entered enemy territory alone, except for a few diplomatic officers. The journey through space was quiet, and he spent the time studying Xyloran culture, customs, and political factions. His mind had always been his strongest weapon, and he knew that understanding his new surroundings would matter just as much as defending himself physically. He practiced traditional Xyloran greetings, memorized the names of the major noble families, and prepared himself for their judgment. He expected distrust and cold reception, and he was correct. When the shuttle landed at the Imperial Palace, Alexander stepped out in formal military uniform and stood straight. His face was calm, his movements respectful, but the crowd was hostile. Xyloran nobles, soldiers, and citizens stared at him with open disdain. They whispered among themselves, some even smirking. They thought humans were unsuited for leadership, weak in body and mind, and unworthy to stand beside a royal Xyloran. Alexander heard the whispers clearly, but his expression never changed. He had heard worse during the war. If insults were the cost of peace, he would endure them. Princess Sarilith stood at the top of the palace steps, waiting to receive him. She was tall and impressive, armored in ceremonial clothing that showed her status. Her posture was perfect, her eyes sharp and intelligent. Alexander bowed respectfully in the Xyloran style, lowering one knee to acknowledge her royal position. The courtiers watched closely, expecting him to insult the tradition or perform it incorrectly. They were surprised when he did it flawlessly. Sarilith noticed his precision, and the respect in his movements. She offered a formal greeting, controlled and diplomatic. Their first words to each other were polite, but stiff. Nothing more than duty. Inside the palace, Alexander was taken to guest quarters that were luxurious, but guarded. The Empire had not learned to trust him yet. He was watched constantly by soldiers and attendants. Every action he took was judged. Even the way he walked was analyzed by the nobles, who wanted to find weakness. Many believed the marriage would only show the universe how superior the Xyloran were compared to humanity. They expected Alexander to be overwhelmed or intimidated by their traditions. They expected him to break. Instead, he remained calm, measured, and disciplined. At dinners, the nobles made indirect insults about humanity's size, strength, intelligence, and achievements. Alexander never responded with anger. He answered each comment with patience and logical clarity. He spoke about Terran history, human philosophy, and the value of diplomacy. He discussed battle strategies openly, showing a level of knowledge the nobles had not expected. Even though many still mocked him, a few began to look at him with new curiosity. He was not what they expected. He was not weak, and he did not let emotion rule him. Sarilith watched him carefully, trying to understand him. She had grown up surrounded by warriors who proved strength through physical force. Alexander demonstrated another kind of strength, mental, steady, and shaped by years of responsibility. Their first private conversation happened several days after his arrival. They met in one of the palace gardens, quiet and empty, except for guards at a respectful distance. Sarilith asked him directly why he had agreed to this marriage. Alexander answered simply that peace mattered more than personal comfort. He told her that humanity had lost too much already, just as the Xyloran had. The war had tested both sides, and endless fighting had become pointless. Sarilith listened and saw honesty in his voice. It surprised her more than she wanted to admit. She told him that her people believed humans were weak. Alexander did not take offense. He simply answered that strength could be measured in many ways. Force alone did not win wars. Intelligence, adaptability, and unity were also forms of power. His calm answer stayed with her after their meeting ended. It was the first time she wondered if perhaps humanity was deeper than the Empire had chosen to believe. The first days of the marriage agreement were filled with suspicion, pressure, and political tension. Alexander was alone in a palace where almost everyone doubted him. But he did not bend. Every day he showed patience, discipline, and quiet determination. Little by little, the first cracks in the Xyloran assumptions began to appear. No one knew it yet, but the Empire was just starting to understand the truth. This human they looked down on was far more capable than they imagined, and his presence would change everything that came after. Alexander Hale spent his first weeks in the Xyloran palace under constant observation. Every step he took, every word he spoke, and every expression on his face was judged by the nobles. They treated him politely in public. But behind closed doors, they made cruel jokes about humans. Alexander knew all of this. Yet he never reacted. He walked through the palace with calm dignity, the posture of a man who understood that every movement was part of a larger political game. He attended council meetings where Xyloran ministers discussed matters of the Empire. Most of them ignored him, speaking as if he did not exist. Some pretended he was furniture rather than a person. One military commander loudly commented that humans were known for being slow thinkers. He said this while looking directly at Alexander, waiting for him to become upset. Instead, Alexander simply asked a thoughtful question about the Empire's military supply lines, showing a deep understanding of logistics. The room paused, and the commander's face tightened. Alexander had answered without insult, but his knowledge proved the commander wrong in front of everyone. Many nobles did not like him after that moment. They were not used to humiliation delivered so politely. Princess Sarilith watched everything quietly. She had not chosen this marriage, but she respected anyone who showed strength, no matter what kind it was. She noticed that Alexander never tried to force the nobles to accept him. He let their insults fall like dust and waited for his actions to speak instead. He was unusual. Xyloran nobles were aggressive in speech and body language, but Alexander was steady and disciplined. It confused people, and confusion made them uneasy. Alexander spent his free time studying Xyloran history, science, and political systems. He understood that knowledge was his best weapon. While the nobles underestimated him, he learned everything he could about the empire. He memorized royal bloodlines, military ranks, ancient heroes, and social laws. His mind worked calmly and quietly, building strategies without noise. He did not try to change anything. He simply prepared. Life in the palace was lonely. His human officers had been sent back after delivering him, and communication with the Terran Union was limited. Alexander ate meals alone in a private room unless required at official events. He did not have friends here, only watchers. Guards stood near his doors at all hours. They said it was for his protection, but he understood that they were there to prevent him from wandering freely. Still, he did not complain. He followed the rules, observed everything, and waited for the moment to prove himself. Some evenings, nobles would invite Sarilith to social gatherings, dinners, dances, and strategic game competitions. Alexander was often required to attend, usually as a silent decoration beside the princess. The nobles loved demonstrating their superiority during these events. They debated politics in loud voices and told dramatic stories of battlefield victories. They bragged about how Xyloran minds and bodies had evolved for war. They spoke about humans as if they were insects, climbing a tree too tall for them. Alexander listened but rarely spoke unless someone addressed him directly. When he did speak, his answers were thoughtful and well-reasoned. He often surprised the nobles by offering strategic theories they had never considered. One night, during a formal dinner, a noble challenged him to predict the outcome of a hypothetical war scenario. Alexander calmly explained how both sides would likely move, how supply shortages would influence tactics, and how a peaceful settlement would save more lives and resources. The room fell silent. His prediction was so accurate and realistic that even the military officers could not disagree. Some nobles grew angrier at him, but a few began to watch him with curiosity. They could not understand how he maintained such quiet confidence. They expected humans to be weak or emotional. Instead, Alexander was controlled, intelligent, and more prepared than anyone had guessed. Sarilith felt the same confusion. She met with him several times a week to discuss their duties as future partners of two governments. At first, their conversations were formal and short. She asked standard questions, and he gave polite answers. But as the weeks passed, their discussions grew more open. She began asking questions not from duty, but from personal curiosity. One afternoon, she asked him how he could remain calm when surrounded by hostility. Alexander answered that humans had spent generations fighting to survive. He explained that peace required more strength than war. Only those who controlled themselves could control the future. Sarilith had never heard someone speak of peace with such intensity. For her people, peace was simply the absence of conflict. For Alexander, it was a goal worth fighting for. She began to see how different humans were not physically stronger, but mentally hardened by centuries of struggle. Alexander was not afraid of being surrounded. He was used to it. He was a soldier who had seen too much destruction and had chosen a higher path. Even so, the palace was not a safe place. Many nobles resented Alexander's presence. They believed the empire had lowered itself by marrying a human. Some whispered that the emperor had grown weak. A few saw Alexander as a threat, not because of his strength, but because of his influence over the princess. If Sarilith grew to respect him, then others might follow. That fear planted the first seeds of hatred in certain hearts. Rumors spread through the palace corridors. Servants spoke softly about secret meetings in unused halls. Guards noticed increased communication between certain nobles late at night. Something was changing behind the scenes, and Alexander could sense it. He did not know the details, but his instincts told him that resistance to the peace agreement was growing. One evening, after a long council meeting, Alexander walked alone toward his quarters. The corridor was nearly empty, with only a few guards at the far end. A senior noble stepped into his path, a man who had spoken against him many times during assemblies. The noble stared at him with narrow eyes and said in a low voice that this marriage would not save anyone. He said the empire would never bow to humanity. His hand rested on the handle of a ceremonial blade, as if he was waiting for Alexander to show fear. Alexander simply replied that peace was not surrender, but progress. His voice was calm, without threat. He bowed respectfully and walked around the noble without looking back. The noble stood frozen, uncertain how to react. He had expected anger. He had been ignored like a child throwing a tantrum. That humiliation would not be forgotten. When Alexander reached his quarters, he thought about the encounter. It was clear that the danger around him was not only political. Some people might soon decide that removing him was easier than accepting peace. He prepared himself mentally. He did not wish for violence, but he was not afraid of it. He had survived many battlefields before. A royal palace full of angry nobles was not the most dangerous place he had ever been. The days continued, and the political marriage became less of a symbol and more of a test. Alexander had to prove that humanity was worthy of standing beside the Xyloran Empire. Every insult, every challenge, every hostile glance became part of that test. And though most of the empire still believed humans were weak, a few had begun to sense the truth. Commander Alexander Hale was not the easy target they expected. He was something far more dangerous, a man who refused to break. Weeks passed inside the Xyloran Imperial Palace, and the air grew heavier with silent tension. Alexander Hale had become a presence that could not be ignored. Some nobles were angry, others were curious, and a few had started to quietly respect him. But behind the walls and decorated halls, a different movement was growing. One hidden in shadows and whispered conversations. A group of powerful Xyloran nobles had decided that peace with humans was a mistake. They did not care about the war's casualties. They only cared that their empire must appear unchallenged and superior. If peace made them look weak, then peace had to be destroyed. They began meeting in secret rooms far from the emperor's eyes. They were not small thinkers or angry fools. They were officers, governors, and influential advisors. Some had lost family in the war and wanted revenge. Others feared that if humans continued to grow stronger, the empire would one day stand second place in the galaxy. Their fear turned to hatred, and that hatred grew into a plan. They agreed that the diplomatic marriage must not succeed. If the empire could not destroy the Terran Union on the battlefield, then the peace agreement must be broken from the inside. Their leader, an old noble named Lord Kyrith, believed that the simplest way to break the marriage was to turn both governments against each other again. He proposed killing Princess Sarilith and making it look as if Alexander were responsible. If the princess died under his protection, the emperor would have no choice but to call humans traitors. The empire would attack again, and the war would continue with new fury. It was a terrible plan, and the conspirators knew it. But none of them cared. They believed war was the only true language of the universe. While they met in secret chambers, Alexander lived his days quietly. He noticed small signs guards replaced by unfamiliar soldiers, certain nobles whispering more than usual, and servants avoiding certain hallways. He had lived through too many campaigns not to recognize the feeling of growing danger. He did not know the details yet, but his instincts told him that something harmful was coming. Alexander continued meeting Princess Sarilith to handle political duties. One evening, They walked together in a palace garden of tall silver trees and blue-leaf flowers that glowed softly in the dim light. The night was calm, but the silence between them felt heavy. Serelith finally spoke and asked him if he felt unwelcome. Alexander answered honestly that he knew many wanted him gone, and that he did not blame them. War created deep wounds, and wounds did not heal easily. She looked at him carefully, searching his face for fear or anger. She saw neither. Serelith found herself growing more curious about this human. He did not act like a defeated man or a frightened outsider. He acted like a man who carried scars, but refused to show weakness. She asked him what life in the Terran Union was like. He spoke softly about cities built on moons, about children learning diplomacy and science from a young age, and about the hope that humans had for their future. She listened in silence, realizing for the first time that humans dreamed just like the Xyloran did. They were not only their enemies, they were another civilization, trying to survive the same endless universe. Their conversation was interrupted when a palace guard arrived, bowing deeply. He informed the princess of an emergency meeting between senior nobles. Serelith excused herself, leaving Alexander alone in the moonlit garden. The guard walked away with her, but one man remained in the shadows, watching Alexander. Alexander noticed the figure only for a moment before the person disappeared. That short moment was enough to confirm his fear he was being watched more closely now. Later that night, Alexander worked alone in his room. He studied maps of Xyloran trade routes and analyzed supply shortages across the empire. He did not expect to use this information for military action. He simply wanted to understand how the empire functioned. But while reading, he remembered the changes he had seen during the last days. Suspicion was growing too fast to be natural. Something bigger was happening. He began reviewing palace guard schedules, guest lists, and shifts of command officers. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Yet with a professional eye, he spotted unusual patterns. Certain guards were being rotated out too quickly, while others were stationed in places where they normally had no reason to be. That was a classic sign of internal military movement. Someone was preparing for something. Alexander decided not to confront anyone with accusations. Without proof, he would only make enemies. Instead, he continued observing everything quietly. He was a soldier who had survived wars by thinking carefully before acting. He would not rush now. A few days later, during a council session, Alexander noticed the absence of two ministers who always attended. The meeting continued as if nothing was wrong. When it ended, Alexander approached a lower-level clerk and politely asked why the ministers had not attended. The clerk hesitated, nervous, and whispered that he had been told not to speak. That reaction made everything clear. Someone was silencing people. Someone was preparing to move. Serelith also noticed the changes. During private meetings, she told Alexander that more nobles seemed tense or distracted. She suspected political conflict, but she did not yet see the danger. Alexander did. One night, after studying the palace again, he decided to share his observations with the princess. When they met the next day, he told her that a faction seemed to be forming against the marriage. She narrowed her eyes and asked him how he knew. Alexander gently explained the changes he had seen. Unusual guard rotations, absence of ministers, and growing secrecy among certain nobles. Serelith was surprised. She had noticed small signs but had not connected them. She looked at him differently that day, with the respect given to a capable strategist. She asked him how he had learned to observe so deeply. His answer was quiet and honest. Humanity had survived because they did not rely only on strength. They learned from fear, from war, and from mistakes. They studied their enemies and the environment carefully. They evolved by thinking faster and adapting quicker. Serelith realized then that humans were not weak. They had simply been underestimated for generations. But while the princess was beginning to understand, The conspirators had reached the final stage of their plan. Lord Kyreth assembled his followers in a hidden transport bay beneath the palace. They carried elite imperial weapons and wore dark armor with no royal emblems. Their mission was simple: infiltrate the palace, kill the princess, and leave evidence pointing to the human commander. They believed the emperor, blinded by grief, would declare war instantly. Their soldiers waited for the signal, unaware that Alexander had begun to see through their plans. That night, Alexander stood on the balcony of his quarter, looking across the city of shining towers. The view was beautiful, but his mind was not on beauty. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat, told him something terrible was coming. Peace was hanging by a thread, and that thread was about to break. He did not yet know who would strike or when. He only knew that when the moment came, he would have to act not as a political husband, but as a soldier, because the fate of two civilizations would depend on what he did next. The night the coup began, the imperial palace looked peaceful from the outside. The city lights reflected off the tall towers, and the stars above shone brightly. No one in the streets knew that a silent storm was about to strike the heart of the empire. The conspirators moved quietly through lower corridors, wearing dark armor and carrying weapons meant for close combat. They had chosen the perfect time late in the night, when most people were asleep and the shift of palace guards was changing. Their plan was simple: kill Princess Sarilith, frame Alexander Hale, and restart the war with humanity. In his quarters, Alexander could not sleep. Something deep inside him warned that this was the moment everything would break. His instincts, trained through countless battles, told him that danger was coming. He stood near the window, staring at the city below, thinking through every possibility. He did not know when an attack would come, but he had prepared himself. He checked the personal combat implants hidden beneath his skin, small devices humans use to enhance their senses, reaction time, and battlefield awareness. They were silent, but powerful. Even though the Xyloran believed they understood human technology, they had little idea what experienced Terran soldiers could do when pushed into survival mode. As he stood there in the quiet room, a sudden alarm flashed in the corner panel of his door. It was not loud, but the blinking signal told him someone had forced access into the palace's secure sections. The security feeds, which he had studied out of habit, showed guard positions shifting in strange patterns. Many guards were leaving their posts and being replaced by unfamiliar soldiers. That was all Alexander needed to know. The attack had begun. He did not waste time. He grabbed a slim handheld device from under the desk drawer, something the Xyloran believed was only a personal communicator. In reality, it was advanced Terran military tech that could interface with most digital systems at short range. With practiced motion, he tapped a hidden command pattern that activated his implants fully. The world seemed to sharpen. His body felt lighter, faster, and more focused. This was what Terran soldiers called operational mode, the mental state between instinct and precision. Outside in the hallway, shouting echoed from distant rooms. Alexander could hear the clash of weapons and the heavy steps of armored soldiers moving quickly. The attack was focused and planned. It was happening exactly as his instincts had predicted. Elsewhere in the palace, Sarilith had been awakened by her guards. She was still half-dressed in her night clothing when the alarm sounded. Her personal guards formed a defensive ring, but even they looked uneasy. None of them had expected such a strike inside the most secure building of the empire. Sarilith grabbed her ceremonial sword, but knew that she could not rely on blade alone. She moved toward the safe room deeper in the palace, but the route was blocked a few moments later as the corridors filled with hostile soldiers advancing in complete silence. These were not regular troops. They moved with disciplined precision. Before her guards could decide whether to fight or retreat, the group of attackers opened fire. The hallway exploded into chaos. Guards fell, and Sarilith had to duck behind a heavy stone column. She realized then that this was no simple attack. Someone inside the palace had planned this for months. Someone powerful. Then, before another wave of attackers could strike, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Sarilith almost did not recognize him at first. Alexander Hale sprinted forward, moving with speed she had never seen in a human. His steps were fast but controlled, the movement of a soldier trained to kill efficiently. His eyes were focused, sharp, and completely calm. He carried no visible weapon at first. Instead, he used the narrow corridor to his advantage. He lunged forward, disarming the first attacker with a calculated strike that knocked the alien off balance. Alexander grabbed the fallen weapon in mid-motion and fired 3 controlled shots, hitting the next group of attackers before they could react. The guards and attackers alike froze for a moment, shocked by the sudden shift. Sarilith stared at him in disbelief. She had known humans were intelligent, but she had never imagined one fighting with such skill and precision. Alexander stood between her and the attackers, and for the first time, the palace guards saw the human not as a foreign diplomat, but as a warrior. More attackers rushed in, and Alexander moved again, faster than anyone expected. His implants helped him calculate angles, distances, and enemy positions in seconds. He slid across the floor, using fallen bodies as shields, firing and striking without hesitation. The attackers, who had believed humans incapable of such combat, found themselves overwhelmed by his speed and strategy. Xyloran soldiers watching from the sides stared with wide eyes as the weak human fought like a veteran of 100 battles. Once the corridor was clear, Sarilith regained her breath and stepped forward. Her guards looked shaken, but Alexander was already scanning the area for the next threat. He told her calmly that this attack was planned to kill her and blame humanity, and that they needed to move immediately. His voice was steady, not shaken by the violence around him. Sarilith nodded without argument. She finally understood that this human was not someone to be protected. He was someone who protected others. As they moved through the palace, Alexander led them through alternate hallways he had memorized earlier. He had studied the palace layout for diplomatic safety. But now, that knowledge became a survival map. They encountered several enemies along the way, and each time Alexander reacted with sharp accuracy. Sometimes he fought hand to hand, striking at weak points in alien armor. Other times, he used fallen weapons, firing measured bursts that dropped enemies before they could shoot. Sarilith, a trained fighter, joined the battles as well. Together, they formed a silent partnership, one striking with royal precision, the other with practiced combat logic. The guards who remained followed them, now seeing Alexander differently. He was no longer the outsider they doubted. He was the reason they were still alive. At one point, they reached a wide hall where dozens of attackers were advancing. It seemed impossible to cross, but Alexander quickly analyzed the scene. He ordered Sarilith and the guards into a side passage while he provided a distraction. The princess refused at first, but he looked at her with firm eyes and explained that the attackers wanted her dead more than him. The guards pulled her back as Alexander moved forward alone. He charged into the hall, sliding behind a fallen sculpture. He used its base as cover and fired carefully at support beams overhead. The ancient pillars cracked, dropping heavy stone pieces on advancing soldiers. The floor shook, and the enemy formation broke. Before they could recover, Alexander rushed forward again, taking advantage of their disorder. He did not fight like a brute force warrior. He fought like a man who could see the battlefield 3 moves ahead. When he later regrouped with Sarilith, she looked at him with new eyes. The marriage alliance had been arranged to end a war, but she saw now that humanity had never been weak. They were survivors who had learned to overcome impossible odds. Alexander was proof. By the time they reached the throne room entrance, enemy bodies and broken weapons marked their path. Alexander stood with heavy breath, not because he was tired, but because he knew this was only the beginning. The conspirators had failed to kill the princess in silence, and now the palace was waking to the truth. For the first time, Sarilith spoke with something more than formality. She told Alexander that the Empire owed him their lives. Alexander answered simply that peace required both sides to survive. There was no pride in his voice, only steady conviction. Outside the throne room, guards were gathering, preparing to retake the palace. The greatest fight was coming. And Alexander tightened his grip on the weapon. He did not come to the Empire to show his true power. The universe would soon learn that humanity had been underestimated for too long. The throne room of the Xyloran Imperial Palace was built to intimidate. Tall pillars made of dark stone rose toward a ceiling carved with the history of the Empire. Golden banners hung on the walls, showing the royal symbol in proud detail. Normally, it was a place of tradition and ceremony. But on this night, the air was filled with shouts, running guards, and the sound of distant battles shaking the floor. The conspirators had moved faster than anyone expected, and loyal soldiers were fighting to regain control of the palace. Princess Sarilith and Alexander Hale reached the great doors of the throne room, guarded by palace defenders who had just learned of the betrayal. The guards looked exhausted, but when they saw the princess alive, relief washed over their faces. Many had feared she had already fallen. The commander of the guard bowed deeply, apologizing for their failure to protect her. Sarilith raised her hand and told him no apology was needed. The attack had been sudden and planned by trusted nobles. None of them were ready for such treachery. Alexander stood beside her, his uniform torn and stained from battle. His breathing was controlled, but his eyes were alert. He could feel footsteps approaching in the corridors behind them. The attackers had not given up. They would return with more soldiers soon. The palace defenders were brave, but they were outnumbered. If they stood and fought normally, the throne room would become a slaughterhouse. Alexander studied the room quickly and saw something others did not. The throne room had multiple entrances, but each doorway was narrow and defensible. If they organized correctly, a small force could hold off a much larger number. He spoke to the guard commander, suggesting a defensive formation that the Xyloran had never used but was common in human ground warfare. At first, the guards hesitated. They had spent generations believing humans lacked military wisdom. But after seeing Alexander fight, they did not question him again. The guards moved into position, forming controlled choke points and overlapping fire angles. Sarilith watched him directing soldiers and realized how many lives his calm strategic thinking had already saved. He was no ordinary diplomat. He was a man shaped by survival and duty. The Emperor was already inside, protected by his elite guards. When Sarilith entered, he stood up from his throne, shock crossing his face when he saw her alive. For a moment, he simply stared. Then his expression softened into relief. His daughter bowed and explained the situation quickly. The Emperor listened in silence, while Alexander stood respectfully behind her. When Sarilith mentioned the attempted assassination and the plan to blame humanity, the Emperor's expression darkened. He realized that the conspiracy was not just about attacking his family, it was meant to throw the galaxy back into war and make him look powerless. He turned his eyes toward Alexander, studying him carefully. Until now, the Emperor had accepted the marriage only as political necessity. He had not expected the human to take such decisive action or to risk his life to save the princess. Alexander remained calm under the Emperor's gaze, waiting silently. Without words, his presence said everything. He had not come to the Xyloran Empire to lie, to manipulate, or to weaken them. He had come to honor the peace between their worlds. Before the Emperor could speak further, the palace doors shook violently. The conspirators were regrouping for a final push. The attackers had not expected their mission to fail, and now they wanted to force their victory through sheer numbers. The guards outside shouted warnings, and Alexander quickly moved back toward the entrance with the defenders, weapon ready. Sarilith followed, standing beside him. The guards tried to convince her to stay safe behind the throne, but she refused. She was heir to the Empire. She would not hide, while others fought for her life. The battle resumed with violent intensity. The attackers rushed forward with powerful weapons and combat armor. But this time, they collided with a far more coordinated defense. Alexander's strategy turned the narrow doorways into traps. The conspirators tried to push through, but their numbers worked against them in close space. Guards fired in controlled bursts, while others held the line with spears and blades. Alexander moved with precision among them, giving quick instructions, redirecting soldiers, and personally striking down enemies that broke through. At one moment, a group of armored attackers managed to break into the room using explosive charges. The blast threw several guards to the ground and blew dust into the air. Before the attackers could fire again, Alexander leaped forward, using the confusion to close the distance. His implants enhanced his movements, and his blows came fast and controlled. He disabled 2 soldiers in seconds and used the first attacker's fallen weapon to hold off the others until reinforcements arrived. The guards who saw him in action could barely believe a human could fight like that. Stories about human weakness had spread for generations, and now those stories shattered in front of their eyes. Sarilith also fought alongside her soldiers, her sword glowing in the dim light. She protected her people not as a princess who expected loyalty, but as a warrior willing to bleed for those she commanded. Many guards, seeing her courage and Alexander's determination, found new strength. Their defense grew stronger, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Inside the throne room, the conspirators' leader, Lord Kyrith, appeared with a final attempt to seize power. His armor was decorated with centuries-old battle symbols, and his face showed pride turned to madness. He shouted that the Empire was losing its honor by standing beside humans. He claimed that the Xylaren should rule the galaxy alone, not share it with small, fragile creatures. His speech was meant to inspire, but most guards looked at Alexander and Sarilith instead. They had already seen the truth with their own eyes. Kyrith lunged forward, aiming to strike Sarilith himself. Before he could reach her, Alexander moved. The two clashed, exchanging strikes that echoed across the throne room. Kyrith was strong and heavily armored, but Alexander fought with precision and adaptability. He did not try to overpower the noble. He used his own weight and momentum against him. In a final moment, Alexander knocked Kyrith off balance and pinned him to the ground. The remaining conspirators saw their leader fall, and their courage broke. They surrendered or fled, and loyal forces chased them out of the palace halls. When silence finally returned, the palace was damaged, stained, and filled with exhausted defenders. But Sarilith stood alive, and so did the peace treaty. The emperor approached Alexander and looked at him not as a foreigner, but as someone who had protected his family and his empire. He publicly declared that Alexander had saved the future of both civilizations. His voice carried through the damaged throne room with clear strength. No one doubted him. News spread across the empire within hours. People learned that a human had defended the royal family and defeated elite warriors in combat. Many who once believed humans weak changed their minds. Respect for humanity began to grow, not through fear, but through understanding. In the following days, the conspirators were exposed and arrested. Sarilith and Alexander attended political assemblies together, standing not as strangers, but as partners. Sarilith spoke openly of Alexander's bravery and intelligence, surprising many nobles who had underestimated him. Slowly, the empire began to trust the idea of peace. Alexander himself did not change. He continued to serve with calm patience, never using his power for pride. He believed that peace was not earned once it had to be protected every day. Sarilith, now seeing the truth of his strength, found herself respecting him deeply. Their marriage had begun as a political duty, but now it represented something stronger. It symbolized the possibility that two civilizations could stop fighting and start building a future together. Across the galaxy, people whispered a new message. Humanity was not weak. Humanity learned, adapted, and endured. The universe had underestimated them for too long. And now everyone knew the truth. Humanity was here to stay, and the alliance between the Terran Union and the Xyloran Empire marked the beginning of a new age. Peace had survived not because of tradition or fear, but because a single human refused to break when it mattered most.